When we picture medieval resistance movements, the images that come to mind are often the same: fierce knights storming castles, rebel leaders rallying troops, the clash of steel on steel. But what if I told you that some of the most vital figures in these struggles weren't on the battlefield at all? They were women hidden in plain sight, orchestrating rebellions from the shadows. While history books celebrate kings and warriors, the truth is far more fascinating. Women were the secret glue holding resistance movements together, their stories buried under centuries of neglect. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on these unsung heroines, revealing how they shaped the course of history with nothing but wit, courage, and sheer determination. Think about the medieval world, a time when women were supposed to be silent, obedient, confined to the home. Yet, somehow, they found ways to defy expectations, becoming spies passing critical intelligence under the noses of their enemies, healers keeping rebel fighters alive, and even financiers bankrolling entire uprisings. These women didn't just support resistance movements, they sustained them. Their strategies were subtle, their influence undeniable, yet their names are barely a footnote in most historical accounts. Why? Because power has always been about who gets to tell the story, and for too long, those in charge decided these women's roles weren't worth remembering. But here's the thing: when we ignore these stories, we don't just lose a chapter of history, we miss out on understanding how resistance truly works. It's not always about brute force or loud declarations. Sometimes it's the quiet defiance of a woman smuggling messages in her laundry, or the strategic mind of a noblewoman using her social status to shield rebels. These were acts of courage just as bold as any sword fight. So today we're setting the record straight. From forgotten archives to overlooked chronicles, we'll uncover how women kept the flames of rebellion alive, and why their legacy matters now more than ever. This isn't just history, it's a revelation, and by the end of this journey, you'll never look at the medieval world the same way again. Imagine a rebellion cut off from supplies, its fighters starving, its leaders isolated. This was the fate many resistance movements narrowly avoided, thanks to the ingenuity of women working in secret. While knights and soldiers drew the enemy's attention, women moved unseen through the streets, their baskets and bundles hiding more than just bread or herbs. A loaf might conceal a coded message. A bundle of linens could hide weapons or medicine. These women weren't just helpers, they were strategists, exploiting the very stereotypes that underestimated them. Society expected them to be harmless, preoccupied with domestic duties, and that became their greatest weapon. Take the case of medieval towns under siege. While defenders held the walls, it was often women who kept the resistance alive. They lowered baskets from windows to hoist up food smuggled past enemy lines. They pretended to fetch water from wells, using the opportunity to pass information between rebel cells. Some even disguised themselves as servants or pilgrims, slipping through checkpoints with vital intelligence. These weren't random acts of bravery, they were calculated, systematic efforts to outmaneuver oppressive forces. And because women were rarely seen as threats, their actions flew under the radar, making them the perfect operatives in a silent war. Then there were the noblewomen, whose high status gave them unique advantages. While their husbands or fathers might be watched closely, these women used their social privileges to host secret meetings in their manor halls or convents. They funneled wealth into rebel coffers, disguising funds as charitable donations or dowries. Some even manipulated political alliances, leveraging family connections to sway powerful figures toward the resistance cause. Their influence was quiet but far-reaching, proving that power in the medieval world wasn't always won with a sword. Sometimes it was wielded through a well-placed word or a carefully timed favor. But perhaps the most overlooked role was that of the healers. In an age without modern medicine, women skilled in herb lore and midwifery became the backbone of rebel survival. They treated wounds in hidden cellar clinics, using plants gathered under the guise of foraging. Their knowledge kept fighters alive through fevers and infections, ensuring the rebellion didn't bleed out before its time. And because their work was dismissed as women's craft, it rarely drew suspicion, even as they nursed fugitives back to health under the noses of occupying forces. These stories aren't just footnotes, they're proof that resistance was always a collective effort, one that relied as much on cunning as on courage. The women who kept these networks alive didn't just serve the cause, they redefined what it meant to fight. Their legacy reminds us that history's most powerful rebellions weren't just won on battlefields, they were sustained in the shadows, by hands the world never thought to watch. History remembers Joan of Arc's battlefield heroics, but behind every famous warrior were dozens of unseen women who turned gossip into warfare and household chores into acts of rebellion. Their greatest weapon being underestimated. In a world where men dominated politics and war, women's supposed disinterest in such matters became their perfect disguise. Noble women hosted feasts where enemy commanders let their guard down, their loose tongues spilling battle plans between cups of wine. Servants scrubbing castle floors memorized discarded letters left on tables, stitching secrets into embroidery patterns or hiding them in prayer books. Even peasant women selling eggs at market stalls were often part of elaborate intelligence networks, using coded phrases about poultry prices to signal troop movements. The genius of these female spies lay in their invisibility. A man lingering near a military camp would draw suspicion, but a woman fetching water or tending laundry. She was part of the scenery. This allowed them to document fortifications, count soldiers, and track supply routes without raising alarms. Some of the most critical intelligence in medieval rebellions came from these everyday acts. A midwife traveling between villages could smuggle messages in her birthing kit. A nun delivering alms to the poor might slip rebel leaders a map hidden in a Bible. Their methods were so effective that occupying forces often never realized their defeats stemmed from leaks traced back to the very women they'd ignored. One remarkable case comes from 13th century Occitania, where a noblewoman named Esclarmonde de Foix used her piety as a shield. By day, she was a devout patron of the local church, but by night, she relayed Cathar resistance plans through coded hymns sung during Vespers. Her choir became an intelligence hub, with each melody's rhythm indicating safe routes for fugitives. Elsewhere, in the Welsh rebellions against English rule, tavern keepers' wives like Gwenllian Furch Rhys kept tankards filled while memorizing soldiers' drunken boasts, then passed details to rebel scouts through seemingly innocent lullabies sung to children. What made these women so indispensable wasn't just their access, it was their creativity. Without formal training, they devised ingenious systems, dyeing specific threads in a tapestry to mark enemy positions, baking hollow loaves with hidden compartments, or using laundry hung on lines to signal approaching danger. Their contributions weren't just supportive, they were strategic masterstrokes that often determined which side held the advantage. And because their work left few written records, their stories survived only in fragments, a line in a merchant's ledger about a talkative milkmaid, or a frustrated general's diary complaining that rebels knew too much too soon. These women redefined espionage centuries before modern spy agencies existed. They operated without gadgets or glory, their victories measured in whispers that toppled tyrants and kept hope alive. While history fixated on kings and treaties, the real pulse of rebellion often beat in the hands of women who proved that the quietest voices could sometimes shake the world. Money makes the world go round, and in medieval rebellions it was often women who kept that world spinning. While kings and warlords focused on swords and sieges, resistance movements faced a quieter but equally deadly threat: starvation. Armies needed food, weapons, armor, and medicine, all of which required coin. But when official channels were cut off or watched too closely, women stepped into the breach, turning their domestic roles into financial lifelines. Consider the noblewoman whose dowry chest became a rebel treasury. In a society where women controlled wealth through marriage agreements or widowhood, many quietly diverted funds to the cause. A portion of her annual allowance might buy grain for hungry partisans. Jewelry sold at market could purchase blacksmith services for rebel weapons. Some even leveraged their estates, offering hospitality that secretly housed fugitives or stored supplies. These weren't just donations, they were calculated investments in survival. Meanwhile, in bustling towns, merchants' wives played a dangerous double game. Their shops and stalls became fronts for moving resources. A fabric merchant might overorder linen, using the excess to bandage wounded fighters. A baker could lose sacks of flour near rebel hideouts. And because women often managed household accounts, they creatively doctored ledgers to hide discrepancies from prying officials. In places like 14th century Flanders, entire rebel networks were funded through these shadow ledgers, where a line item for spices might actually mean arrows or armor. Peasant women, though lacking gold, contributed just as crucially. They bartered eggs for information, traded woven baskets for safe passage, or hoarded scraps of cloth to stitch into rebel uniforms. In one documented case from the Albigensian Crusade, a group of women in a besieged town organized a rotating system. Each household would hide a single fighter for one night, then pass them to the next home at dawn, all paid for with promises of future favors or shared harvest. This informal economy of trust and barter kept resistance cells operational long after conventional means failed. The most astonishing cases were women who orchestrated entire underground supply chains. Take Marguerite de Provence, a 13th century noblewoman who disguised rebel funding as pilgrimage alms. Donations meant for monasteries instead bought weapons smuggled in coffins labeled as relics. Or the unnamed Breton fishwives who used their daily catch to transport messages and money. Hollowed-out cards stuffed with coins became known as rebel mackerel among resistance fighters. These financial networks thrived because they were invisible to those in power. Men with swords guarded gold shipments, but who would suspect a widow's embroidery circle of running a smuggling ring? Or a group of nuns of using their scriptorium to forge travel passes for rebels. Women's financial ingenuity didn't just fund rebellions, it rewrote the rules of economic warfare. Where brute force failed, a well-placed bribe from a merchant's wife or a strategically lost tax payment from a noblewoman's steward could keep the fight alive for another season. The lesson here is timeless. Revolutions aren't just won with weapons, but with resourcefulness. And in the medieval world, that resourcefulness often wore a dress, carried a market basket, or kept the keys to a household strongbox. Their stories remind us that money has always been a weapon, and sometimes the hand that wields it most effectively is the one no one thinks to watch. Behind every bandaged wound on a rebel fighter, there was likely a woman who risked everything to make that healing possible. While battles raged outside, these women transformed cellars, barns, and even caves into secret hospitals, their hands moving swiftly to stem bleeding, set bones, and brew life-saving remedies from memory. Their knowledge wasn't written in official manuals, it lived in the whispered recipes of grandmothers, the bundled herbs hung to dry in attics, the careful observations of which plants reduced fever or eased pain. In an era when a single infected cut could spell death, these healers were the difference between a rebellion collapsing or fighting another day. Take the story of a woman known only as the Hawthorne Sister in 14th century Scotland. While English soldiers patrolled the Highlands, she operated a clandestine clinic in a ruined chapel, using thorny branches to mark hidden paths to her door. Her patients outlawed rebels arrived under cover of darkness, their wounds packed with moss to stifle blood trails. With no formal training, she relied on centuries of folk wisdom, spider webs to clot bleeding, willow bark tea for inflammation, honey-drenched bandages to prevent rot. Her survival rate defied the odds, though her name never appeared in any chronicle. But healing wasn't just about herbs and poultices. These women were masters of disguise, turning everyday tasks into cover for their work. A laundry boil could actually be a pot of sterilizing water. A basket of wild greens gathered at dawn might contain yarrow for wounds or poppy for pain. Even their clothing played a role. Long skirts hid medical supplies, while the act of kneading bread could mask the grinding of medicinal roots, their greatest innovation. Making medicine look mundane, when authorities searched homes, they saw only domesticity, missing the cellar where a rebel leader recovered under a false floor. Their role as morale boosters was just as critical. In the brutal winters of the 100 Years' War, French resistance fighters spoke of les femmes aux chansons, women who sang as they stitched wounds, their voices weaving hope into every suture. A wounded soldier might wake to find not just a bandage, but a charm sewn into it, a scrap of ribbon from a sweetheart's dress, a saint's medallion stolen from a church. These small acts of tenderness reminded fighters they weren't just casualties, they were human beings worth saving. Some healers took even greater risks. In Moorish-occupied Spain, Jewish and Christian women collaborated in secret, blending Arabic medical texts with local remedies to treat guerrilla fighters. They coded their knowledge in lullabies. A verse about roses in the garden might reference the correct ratio of rosehip to wine for cleansing wounds. When the Inquisition later hunted these women as witches, their real crime wasn't magic, it was keeping resistance alive, one healed fighter at a time. The legacy of these women reshaped medicine itself. Many techniques they pioneered, like using moldy bread to prevent infection, predated modern antibiotics by centuries. Others, like their understanding of sterile bandages, wouldn't be rediscovered until the Crimean War. Yet their contributions were erased, their names reduced to superstitions like wise women or herb witches. But in the shadows, they built something extraordinary, a network of resilience that proved even the fiercest oppression couldn't stamp out compassion or the will to fight another day. Words have always been weapons, and in medieval resistance movements, women wielded them with deadly precision. While men clashed on battlefields, these women fought a quieter war, one where verses could ignite rebellions and nursery rhymes could carry battle plans. They understood something tyrants often forgot, that the most enduring revolutions begin not in the streets, but in the imagination. And so they became masters of propaganda, turning ink and song into tools of liberation. Take the troubadour women of Occitania, who transformed courtly love songs into coded anthems of resistance. To the untrained ear, their lyrics spoke of unrequited passion, but to those fighting French occupation, phrases about the fair lady in the tower signaled rally points, while laments over a rose plucked too soon warned of impending raids. These poet-musicians traveled freely between castles and villages, their performances providing cover for intelligence gathering. A noblewoman requesting a particular ballad might secretly be confirming safe houses were ready. A minstrel lingering too long near a garrison wasn't just entertaining guards, she was memorizing their numbers and arms. Then there were the scribes, often nuns or educated noblewomen, whose quills proved mightier than swords. In scriptoriums across Europe, they produced manuscripts that looked like pious works but contained radical ideas. A beautifully illuminated psalm book might hide rebel manifestos in its marginalia. Prayer scrolls sometimes bore watermarked maps visible only when held to light. Some even developed elaborate ciphers. The 12th century nun Hildegard of Bingen allegedly wove resistance messages into her medical texts, using herb descriptions to denote meeting places. When the moon is in Mandrake, for instance, reportedly meant the next full moon was the time to strike. But perhaps the most ingenious propaganda came from ordinary women who turned daily routines into dissent. Laundresses pinned rebel slogans on clotheslines, arranging shirts and shifts to form symbols visible from castle towers. Market women used gossip networks to spread exaggerated tales of rebel victories, demoralizing occupying forces. In Wales, mothers taught children rhymes that secretly counted English troop movement, innocent playground chants that doubled as intelligence reports. These weren't just messages, they were psychological warfare designed to make oppression feel fragile and resistance inevitable. The impact was profound. When the Siampe revolt shook 14th century Florence, it was washerwomen's songs that unified disparate guilds against the elite. During the Hussite Wars, peasant women adapted folk dances to signal approaching enemies, their swirling skirts mimicking warning beacons. And in Moorish Spain, Jewish and Christian women preserved forbidden languages through lullabies, keeping cultural identity alive under persecution. Their words became seeds planted in darkness, blooming into movements that outlived their oppressors. What made these women so effective was their understanding of power's blind spots. Authorities could ban weapons and patrol roads, but they couldn't suppress every lullaby or censor every recipe shared between neighbors. By weaponizing the ordinary songs, stories, even laundry, these propagandists proved that the most dangerous ideas are those disguised as everyday life. Their legacy reminds us that revolutions aren't just fought with steel, but with stories that refuse to die. History loves to paint medieval warfare as a brutal chess game played by kings and generals, but some of the most brilliant moves came from women who weren't even supposed to be on the board. While their male counterparts relied on sheer force, these female strategists mastered the art of unconventional warfare, turning societal constraints into tactical advantages. Take Matilda of Tuscany, the 11th century noblewoman who didn't just fund rebellions, she commanded them. Standing barely 5 feet tall, she led armies against the Holy Roman Emperor himself, her knowledge of mountain passes and supply routes allowing her smaller forces to outmaneuver far larger ones. Her greatest weapon, understanding that terrain mattered more than troop numbers. While enemy knights bogged down in muddy valleys, Matilda's soldiers struck from cliffs and forests, vanishing before retaliation came. But you didn't need a title to be a master strategist. In the peat bogs of Flanders, peasant women devised guerrilla tactics that baffled professional soldiers. They'd lure armored knights into marshes using decoy livestock, then watch as the weight of their own armor dragged them under. Others organized fishing fleets that smuggled weapons disguised as netting, or used the rhythmic clanging of village blacksmiths to mask the sound of rebel forgers working through the night. Their plans thrived on misdirection, a skill honed from lifetimes of navigating patriarchal rules. What looked like a group of women weaving by candlelight might actually be a war council, their looms' rhythmic clatter drowning out whispered battle plans. Adaptability was their signature. When English forces occupied Welsh villages, local women transformed children's games into training exercises. A game of hide and seek taught youngsters to memorize patrol routes. A knitting circle became a code-making hub, with dropped stitches marking guard rotations. Even something as simple as a harvest festival could hide military drills. Dancers weaving through maypoles practiced the same footwork needed to evade cavalry charges. These women didn't just think outside the box, they reinvented the box entirely, using every resource at hand. The most striking cases were women who weaponized their supposed fragility. A noblewoman feigning illness might be carried past enemy lines in a litter, only for rebels to burst from hidden compartments once inside castle walls. In one documented siege, a group of women surrendered the keys to a city gate with theatrical tears, then slipped sleeping drafts into the occupying army's wine that night. By dawn, rebels strolled in unchallenged. These weren't just tricks, they were calculated psychological operations, exploiting the enemy's underestimation to devastating effect. What united these strategists wasn't formal training, but an intimate understanding of human nature. They knew when to strike and when to wait, how to turn gossip into disinformation, how to make a retreat look like surrender until the perfect moment came to pivot. Their legacies prove that the greatest military minds aren't always those holding the sword. Sometimes they're the ones who taught others where to point them. While castles crumbled and battlefields burned, some of the most precious weapons of resistance weren't forged from steel, they were written on parchment. Monasteries and convents, often dismissed as quiet retreats for pious women, became the nerve centers of intellectual rebellion. Behind cloistered walls, nuns risked everything to preserve the ideas that fueled resistance, their scriptoriums transforming into secret arsenals of thought. A copied manuscript might not seem as dramatic as a sword thrust, but in an age where knowledge was power, these women were safeguarding the soul of entire movements. Take the case of the Beguines, lay religious women in medieval Flanders who operated outside formal church control. Their convents became way stations for hunted rebels, with fugitives disguised as visiting scholars or sick pilgrims. But their real genius lay in their ink-stained fingers. While authorities hunted for weapons, the Beguines meticulously copied banned texts, treatises on liberty, transcripts of rebel speeches, even maps of enemy fortifications, hiding them between the lines of illuminated psalters. To casual inspectors, these were devotional works. To those who knew how to look, they were blueprints for revolution. The work of these scribes required more than just literacy, it demanded nerves of steel. In 12th century Languedoc, nuns developed an entire shadow library during the Albigensian Crusade. Forbidden Cathar texts were transcribed onto strips of vellum sewn into the spines of approved prayer books. Rebel songs were encoded as musical notations in hymn sheets. One particularly daring sister even hollowed out a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, filling it with scrolls that wouldn't surface for 200 years. Their methods were so effective that when occupying forces finally raided these convents, they often left empty-handed, fooled by the sheer ordinariness of women bent over their writing desks. Beyond preserving texts, these women became living libraries. In Ireland, during English suppression of Gaelic culture, elderly nuns taught forbidden poetry to children under the guise of bedtime stories. Each rhyme preserved clan histories, land claims, and rebel lineages. A lullaby about the fox in the henhouse might actually recount a victory over Norman invaders. Similarly, Byzantine nuns during the Latin occupation memorized entire legal codes, reciting them daily to keep Byzantine law alive despite foreign rulers banning its practice. Their minds became vaults no soldier could breach. The most astonishing part, many of these women weren't just copyists, they were innovators. Hildegard of Bingen famously composed music that doubled as resistance anthems, her soaring melodies carrying coded messages about safe routes through Frankish territory. In Moorish Spain, Jewish and Christian nuns collaborated on medical texts that blended Arabic science with rebel healing techniques, ensuring this knowledge survived persecutions. These weren't passive preservers of knowledge, they were its architects shaping ideas that would outlast empires. Their legacy reminds us that the most dangerous rebellions aren't always the loudest. While kings waged wars that filled history books, these women waged a quieter revolution, one where the simple act of dipping a quill into ink could keep hope alive for centuries. In an age when knowledge was control, they proved that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword, especially when wielded by hands the world refused to see. Resistance movements didn't just need fighters, they needed glue. Someone to bind together fractured communities, to turn isolated grievances into collective action. That's where women thrived, operating as the unseen architects of solidarity. While knights swore oaths on battlefields, these women brokered alliances in back kitchens and church courtyards, their real power lying not in weapons but in whispers. They understood something warlords often missed, that rebellions starve without trust, and trust is built one conversation at a time. Consider the market squares of medieval Europe, places where women gathered daily, their chatter dismissed as gossip. But beneath the surface, these exchanges were anything but idle. A fishwife's complaint about rising taxes could ignite a neighborhood. A baker's widow sharing stories of resistance from the next town over might plant the seed of coordination. These women didn't just talk, they curated dissent, stitching together networks of frustration until it formed something dangerous, a shared purpose. In Flanders, records show how linen weavers' wives used the rhythmic clatter of their looms to mask secret meetings, their workshops becoming hubs where peasants, merchants, and disaffected nobles found common cause. Their methods were deceptively simple. A shared meal here, a midwife's visit there, each interaction an opportunity to bridge divides. Take the case of Jewish and Christian women in medieval Spain, who forged alliances under the noses of the Inquisition. They traded recipes with coded ingredients. A pinch of saffron might signal a safe house, while slow-baked bread meant a delayed raid. By the time authorities realized these culinary exchanges were political, entire underground networks had taken root. Similarly, in Ireland, hedge school matrons hosted illegal poetry readings under the guise of wakes, weaving Gaelic resistance into laments for the dead. Their gatherings looked like mourning, but they were really incubators of rebellion. Noblewomen played this game too, leveraging their social privilege to host salons where enemies became allies. A countess's embroidery circle in 14th century France doubled as a planning committee, their needlework patterns mapping out rebel supply routes. In Bohemia, Hussite noblewomen organized pilgrimages that conveniently stopped at rebel strongholds, their piety masking logistical coordination. These women excelled at turning society's expectations against itself. After all, who would suspect a prayer group of plotting revolution? But their most vital role was conflict resolution. Rebellions fractured easily personal grudges, competing agendas, the sheer fatigue of resistance. Women mediated these tensions with brutal pragmatism. A Welsh chronicle tells of a tavern keeper's wife who settled a bloody feud between rebel factions by getting their leaders drunk and making them swear oaths on her child's cradle. In Lombardy, peasant women enforced a bread and salt ritual. Disputing factions had to share a meal before taking up arms again, a tradition that prevented countless internal collapses. Their genius lay in understanding that unity wasn't inspirational, it was logistical. Without it, even the bravest movements crumbled. the lesson of these organizers echoes across centuries. Real change doesn't start with a battle cry, but with someone willing to pass the bread and the message down the table. Their names may be lost, but their legacy isn't. Every time a rebellion outlasted its oppressors, chances are there was a woman in the shadows, turning strangers into allies and despair into strategy. History calls them caretakers. The truth, they were revolution's invisible engineers. Some women didn't just fight for resistance movements, they became the very face of them, their names whispered like battle cries long after their deaths. These were the symbolic figures, the ones whose courage transcended tactics or strategy and ignited something deeper, the unshakable belief that change was possible. Take Jean Hachette, the 15th century Frenchwoman who literally grabbed the enemy's flag during a siege, hurling herself onto the battlefield in nothing but an apron. Her act was reckless, maybe even foolish, but in that moment she crystallized the defiance of an entire city. Overnight, her name became shorthand for resistance, her apron transformed into a banner of rebellion. But symbols weren't always forged in dramatic gestures. Sometimes they grew from quiet, relentless persistence, like the Irish noblewoman Grace O'Malley, who commanded ships and outmaneuvered English fleets, not just through brute force, but by embodying the unconquerable spirit of her people. When Elizabeth I demanded her submission, O'Malley famously refused to bow, declaring her loyalty was to Ireland alone. That act, standing straight when the world demanded she kneel, turned her into a legend. Centuries later, Irish rebels still invoked her name, proving that symbols don't just inspire, they outlive empires. The power of these women lay in their ability to make the abstract tangible. A peasant uprising against unfair taxes was one thing, but when a woman like Marguerite Porete stood trial for heresy and calmly defended her beliefs as the flames rose around her, resistance became something visceral. Her silence in the face of torture said more than any manifesto. Oppression could burn bodies, but not ideas. Similarly, in the streets of medieval Rouen, when Joan of Arc's ashes were scattered in the Seine, her executioners thought they were erasing a threat. Instead, they created a martyr. Fishermen began claiming Joan's face appeared in the river's reflection. Mothers told children her voice lingered in the wind. The harder authorities tried to stamp her out, the larger she loomed in the collective imagination. What made these figures so dangerous to the status quo wasn't just their actions, it was their ordinariness. They weren't distant queens or untouchable saints. They were weavers, widows, and washerwomen who proved that courage wasn't the exclusive domain of the powerful. When a young Catalan girl named Caterina Albert stood trial for writing radical poetry, her refusal to recant despite knowing it would mean exile resonated because she was someone's daughter, someone's neighbor. Her defiance wasn't extraordinary, it was achingly human, and that's what made it contagious. Even in death, these women wielded influence. Folk songs turned their stories into weapons, ballads carrying coded messages between generations. A lullaby about a lady in white might reference a long-dead rebel whose ghost supposedly haunted corrupt officials. Superstition became subversion. Occupying forces might dismiss peasant tales of vengeful spirits, but when their soldiers grew afraid to patrol certain woods at dusk, the legend had done its work. The most brilliant trick these symbolic figures pulled, convincing the oppressed that they were outnumbered not by enemies but by ancestors. Every time a new generation whispered their names, the past rose up to fight alongside the present. Their legacy challenges history's obsession with measurable outcomes. We can tally battles won or lost, but how do you quantify the moment a child hears her grandmother's story and decides she, too, will resist? These women remind us that revolutions aren't just fought with pikes and proclamations, they're sustained by the unshakable certainty that someone, somewhere, once stood up and said, no. And in that refusal, they gave everyone who came after them permission to do the same. When supply lines were cut and rebel camps ran low on essentials, it was often women who stepped into the breach, turning their intimate knowledge of the land into lifelines. While armies relied on predictable roads and guarded routes, these women navigated forgotten deer trails, hidden gullies, and seasonal streams, paths known only to those who'd spent lifetimes gathering herbs, tending livestock, or fetching water. A forest that appeared impenetrable to enemy scouts became a smuggler's highway in their hands, every moss-covered rock and twisted root serving as a waypoint. Take the women of the Scottish Highlands during English occupation. While redcoats patrolled main roads, local wives and daughters moved through the heather like shadows, their woolen skirts stuffed with grain sacks or musket balls. Some perfected the art of peat smuggling, hollowing out blocks of drying turf to hide blades or documents before stacking them innocently by the roadside for collection. Others transformed their very bodies into contraband carriers, winding thin chains of rebel correspondence into their braids or sewing gunpowder into the padding of their bodices. Their greatest advantage: no soldier would dare search a woman as thoroughly as a man, lest he violate strict codes of propriety. Market days became another theater of deception. A woman selling eggs might line her basket with a false bottom, the space beneath cradling surgical tools or coded letters. Cheese wheels could be carefully hollowed and refilled with salt for preserving meat in rebel camps. Even something as simple as a bundle of firewood might conceal a dagger or a rolled map among the kindling. These women didn't just move goods, they weaponized the mundane, exploiting the fact that occupiers rarely looked twice at domestic chores. Domestic spaces doubled as secret infrastructure. A dairy cellar in Normandy hid a trapdoor leading to a tunnel network that supplied the Maquis resistance for months. In Castile, olive oil jars buried beneath kitchen hearths preserved precious ink and parchment from humidity. The most ingenious systems relied on misdirection. A Breton widow's famous soup kitchen for occupying troops actually funneled stolen rations to rebels, her cauldrons simmering with excuses about spoiled broth whenever inspectors grew suspicious. Foraging was equally vital. Women skilled in herb lore knew which roots could sustain starving partisans, acorns leached of bitterness to make flour, lichen that could be boiled into life-saving broth. During the Welsh rebellions, entire networks of foragers marked safe plants with subtle arrangements of stones or twigs, creating a silent language that fed resistance cells without a single incriminating document. Their knowledge wasn't just practical, it was ancestral, passed down through generations of women who'd learned to stretch scarce resources into survival. What made these smugglers and foragers indispensable wasn't just their stealth, it was their adaptability. When one route was discovered, they pivoted instantly. A baker's daughter in Flanders switched from hiding messages in loaves to stitching them into the collars of stray dogs that always found their way home. A group of Italian shepherdesses trained their flocks to block narrow mountain passes on command, buying precious minutes for rebels to escape. Their methods were as diverse as the landscapes they knew so intimately, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act wasn't striking a blow, but ensuring someone else lived to strike it tomorrow. Rebellions don't just need fighters, they need futures. And in the shadows of medieval oppression, women became the quiet architects of that future, weaving resistance into the very fabric of childhood. While authorities hunted rebel leaders, these women turned lullabies into lessons and bedtime stories into battle plans, ensuring the flame of defiance passed to the next generation. Their classrooms had no walls, just the hushed corners of kitchens, the rhythmic clatter of looms, or the whispered conversations during berry picking. Here, children learned that resistance wasn't just about swords. It was about memory and who got to control it. Consider the Gaelic mothers of occupied Ireland, who spun tales of ancient heroes not just to entertain, but to map the landscape of rebellion. A story about the mythical warrior Fionn Mac Cumhaill might secretly teach a child to navigate by certain rock formations used as rebel markers. A nursery rhyme about the fox and the hare could encode escape routes through dense forests. These weren't just stories, they were survival manuals disguised as folklore, ensuring knowledge lived on even if the storytellers didn't. Other women took a more direct approach. In the Basque Country, grandmothers taught children cipher writing using knitting patterns, where a dropped stitch might represent a letter in a coded alphabet. Young girls practicing embroidery stitches were actually learning to replicate the sigils of rebel factions, their samplers doubling as rosters of allies. Even games held purpose. The Welsh version of hide and seek, called cudgel, trained children to identify natural hiding spots and move silently, skills that later kept fugitives alive during English manhunts. The most sophisticated education happened through song. In Occitania, Cathar women composed roundelays where every third verse contained tactical advice, the repetitive structure ensuring even toddlers memorized crucial information. A haunting Breton lullaby about the moon's tears might signal when coastal patrols changed shifts, while a work song from Flanders counted the steps between safe houses in its refrain. Authorities could ban weapons and burn books, but they couldn't stamp out the tunes humming in every cradle. What made these educators so formidable was their long-term vision. They knew rebellions might fail in their lifetime, but if the children remembered, the cause never truly died. Jewish women in medieval Spain baked resistance into Passover traditions, adding extra verses to the Haggadah that recounted local uprisings alongside the Exodus story. In Scotland, midwives slipped tiny carved thistles, symbols of defiance, into swaddling clothes, ensuring newborns entered the world already marked as part of the struggle. These weren't just acts of teaching, they were acts of time travel, sending knowledge forward like arrows shot into the future. Their legacy reshaped what education meant. While formal schools taught obedience to kings and church, these women's lessons celebrated questioning, cunning, and collective power. A child raised on these stories didn't just learn history, they learned how to make it. And when those children grew up to lead their own rebellions, they did so with generations of whispered wisdom at their backs, proof that the quietest lessons often roar the loudest across centuries. While swords clashed and armies mobilized, some of the most critical battles of medieval resistance were fought not on fields, but in quiet chambers where women wielded a different kind of power, the art of negotiation. Queens, noblewomen, and even merchants' wives became master diplomats, their influence stretching across enemy lines like invisible threads holding fragile alliances together. Take Elena of Aquitaine, who famously brokered truces during the Crusades not through force, but through strategic marriages and carefully worded treaties. Or Matilda of Canossa, whose mediation between the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor averted years of warfare. These women understood something many warlords didn't, that lasting victories often came from dialogue, not destruction. Their tactics were as subtle as they were effective. A noblewoman hosting a feast could seat rival faction leaders side by side, letting shared wine and music soften grudges. A queen's private correspondence with foreign rulers might secure safe passage for rebel envoys or arrange covert supply shipments. Even seemingly social gestures, like gifting a rival lord's children finely embroidered clothes, could plant seeds of goodwill that later blossomed into alliances. The key was plausible deniability. When men's negotiations failed, women could always claim they were merely keeping up appearances while quietly advancing rebel interests. Some of their most ingenious work happened under the guise of religious pilgrimage. Noble women traveling to distant shrines became perfect couriers for sensitive messages, their piety shielding them from suspicion. In 14th century Scotland, Lady Agnes Randolph famously used a pilgrimage to Rome as cover to lobby papal support against English occupation, returning with not just blessings but promises of foreign aid. Similarly, Jewish women in medieval Spain leveraged their roles as kosher food providers to arrange meetings between Christian and Muslim dissidents, their kitchens becoming neutral ground where enemies could discuss common cause. The stakes were perilously high. A diplomat's misstep could mean execution, as happened to Jacquet of Luxembourg, accused of treason for secretly corresponding with rebel leaders. Yet women kept taking these risks because their social positions offered unique advantages. A man riding into enemy territory with peace terms would be seen as a spy or provocateur, but a widow delivering condolences for a fallen nobleman. She could pass through checkpoints unchallenged, her black mourning clothes hiding scrolls of rebel demands. Perhaps their greatest legacy was in conflict resolution. When rebel factions turned on each other, it was often women who mediated. Records from the Hussite Wars describe abbesses hosting spiritual retreats where warring captains were made to break bread together, their weapons left at the door. In Wales, a chieftain's daughter named Gwenllian Furch Griffith famously averted a civil war by inviting both sides to her wedding, using the celebration's truce to negotiate terms. These women didn't just stop bloodshed, they transformed rivals into coalitions, proving that sometimes the bravest act was not drawing a sword, but extending a hand. Their methods still resonate today. Modern conflict resolution studies increasingly recognize what medieval women practiced instinctively, that sustainable peace requires more than treaties. It needs relationship building, cultural understanding, and above all, the patience to listen as well as speak. Though their names rarely filled chronicles, these diplomat women shaped history as profoundly as any general, their quiet negotiations echoing far beyond the candlelit rooms where they unfolded. While knights clashed on open fields, another kind of warfare unfolded in the shadows where women turned everyday objects into tools of sabotage. These weren't just random acts of defiance, they were precision strikes designed to cripple oppressors from within. Picture a castle's kitchen where a seemingly obedient servant girl stirred a pot of stew for occupying soldiers. What her captors didn't know, that her special seasoning was ground foxglove leaves, slipped in just enough to induce vomiting and weakness, not death, but enough to render an entire garrison sluggish for days. This was sabotage as an art form, disruptive enough to hamper the enemy, but subtle enough to avoid brutal reprisals against civilians. Some of the most effective tactics targeted supply chains. In occupied Normandy, women working in granaries mixed tiny pebbles with grain shipments, wearing down enemy millstones and causing costly delays. Others accidentally oversalted meat stores or loosened stitching on saddle girths, ensuring horses threw riders at critical moments. The brilliance lay in the ambiguity. Was that spoiled flour negligence or rebellion? By the time authorities suspected foul play, the damage was done with no clear culprit to punish. Communications were another vulnerable point. Messengers relying on local guides might find themselves led in circles by shepherdesses who knew every hill and hollow. Signal fires meant to alert troops mysteriously failed to light, their kindling soaked in vinegar by women fetching water nearby. Even laundry became a weapon. Bleach carefully applied to enemy banners could fade their colors to illegibility, erasing symbols of authority one wash at a time. But the most daring saboteurs operated at night. Welsh chronicles tell of women who mimicked owl calls to coordinate arson attacks on English supply wagons. The the flames masked by the glow of distant hearths. In Lombardy, a group of silk workers wove threads of flax into rope bridges used by enemy scouts' fibers designed to rot quickly when damp, collapsing at the worst possible moment. These weren't just acts of destruction, they were psychological warfare, making oppressors question every piece of equipment, every meal, every order. The true mastery of these saboteurs was their ability to exploit gender stereotypes. A woman tending a brazier to warm a commander's tent wasn't just providing comfort. She might be ensuring his battle plans curled into ash from an accidental spark. A midwife delivering a baby in an enemy officer's household could glean troop movements from careless chatter, then relay them through coded lullabies. Their greatest weapon was the assumption that women's work was harmless. By the time rulers realized their error, the rebellion had already gained ground, not through force, but through the quiet unraveling of their control. These stories reveal a timeless truth. Oppression thrives on predictability, and nothing terrifies a tyrant more than the realization that even the most ordinary hands can become instruments of chaos. The women who mastered this art didn't just weaken their enemies, they proved that resistance could be as simple as a loosened stitch, a misplaced key, or a pot left just a little too long on the fire. History books are written by the victors, but sometimes the truth survives in the margins, stitched into samplers or scribbled between recipes. While official chronicles glorified kings and conquests, women across medieval Europe were quietly compiling something far more dangerous, the real story. Their diaries looked like household accounts, but hidden between notes about thread counts and harvest yields were names of fallen rebels, maps of secret routes, even tallies of enemy troops. A linen chest might hold not just sheets, but scrolls of poetry memorializing battles the crown wanted erased. These women weren't just keeping records, they were guarding the soul of resistance itself. Consider the case of a 15th-century Flemish merchant's wife, whose embroidery frame became a rebel ledger. To casual observers, her work depicted pastoral scenes, but the number of stitches in a tree's leaves corresponded to soldiers lost in a recent skirmish. The colors of flowers marked safe houses, red for danger, blue for shelter. Even the direction of her knots indicated whether occupying forces were advancing or retreating. Her needle was her quill, her silks her ink, and her domestic hobby became a meticulously updated battlefield report. Other women turned letters into clandestine archives. A noblewoman writing to her sister might lament the poor harvest when rebel supplies ran low, or praise the unseasonably warm weather when morale was high. These seemingly innocent phrases built a lexicon of coded distress signals. In southern France, Cathar women composed entire albums of troubadour songs, their lyrics preserving the locations of hidden communities long after persecution scattered them. Authorities burned their books, but they couldn't erase the melodies humming in village squares. The most ingenious record keepers worked in plain sight. Midwives' journals listing births and deaths doubled as rolls of rebel casualties and new recruits. A spice merchant's ledger from Moorish Spain recorded not just cumin and saffron sales, but the movements of underground resistance cells, each transaction a veiled meeting, each a debt, a promise of future aid. Even children's toys held secrets. A German girl's dollhouse was later found to contain miniature maps of city fortifications, its tiny furniture arranged to mark guard rotations. What made these archives so vital was their unassuming nature. While official documents were seized and destroyed, who would confiscate a grandmother's recipe book? Or unravel a young bride's hope chest to check for messages sewn into quilt batting? This camouflage allowed records to survive for generations. A Welsh widow's knitting patterns from the 1300s weren't decoded until the 1970s, revealing troop movements from a rebellion historians thought had left no trace. Their legacy challenges how we define historical evidence. These women proved that ink wasn't the only way to write history. Sometimes it was thread or song, or the careful arrangement of herbs in a kitchen garden. Every time we dismiss women's work as trivial, we risk losing the very threads that connect us to the past. Their hidden archives remind us that resistance isn't just fought with swords, it's preserved with needles, pens, and the stubborn refusal to let the world forget. When the night seemed darkest and the cause most hopeless, it was often a woman's voice cutting through the despair, not with a battle cry, but with a prophecy. Across medieval Europe, mystics and abbesses became the spiritual backbone of resistance movements, transforming faith from a comfort into a call to arms. These women didn't just pray for deliverance, they declared it inevitable, their visions offering rebels something no weapon could, the unshakable belief that heaven itself stood with them. Take Hildegard of Bingen, whose fiery sermons framed defiance against corrupt lords as a holy duty, her letters to powerful men blending scripture with thinly veiled threats of divine retribution. Or Catherine of Siena, whose trance-like ecstasies inspired Florentine rebels to hold their ground against impossible odds, her words convincing them that martyrdom wasn't defeat, it was victory written in celestial ink. Their power lay in their perceived closeness to the divine. A peasant with a sword could be killed, but how do you silence someone who claims to speak for God? When the French crown tried to discredit the mystic Joan of Arc, her uncanny predictions of battlefield outcomes made her seem less a heretic and more an archangel in peasant's garb. Similarly, in the Alpine valleys, the visions of an illiterate shepherdess named Margareta von Ebner became the rallying point for a rebellion against Habsburg rule. Her dreams of a white stag leading the faithful to freedom were embroidered onto rebel banners, turning folklore into fuel for revolution. Abbesses wielded spiritual authority with surgical precision. Behind convent walls, they hosted secret councils where psalms were sung and battle plans whispered. In Saxony, the Abbess Mechthild of Magdeburg used her scriptorium to produce not just illuminated manuscripts, but coded maps of enemy troop movements hidden in the swirls of saints' halos. Others, like the Basque seer Arantxa de Oñati, turned pilgrimages into intelligence-gathering missions, her reports of miracles at shrines actually detailing the weaknesses of fortress walls. Faith was their shield, piety their disguise, but perhaps their most potent weapon was the way they reframed suffering. When rebels faced torture or execution, mystics like Julian of Norwich offered a radical idea. That pain wasn't proof of God's abandonment, but a purification. Her famous revelation, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," became a mantra for resistance fighters, turning despair into endurance. In Hungary, the prophecies of the blind mystic Erzsébet Szilágyi convinced entire villages that their fallen sons would rise again as an army of saints, making even death feel like a temporary setback. These women didn't just inspire, they organized. The Beguines, a semi-monastic order of laywomen, ran underground networks that smuggled rebels between safe houses disguised as spiritual retreats. In Flanders, their beguinages became hospitals for wounded partisans, their nursing justified as Christian charity. Meanwhile, in Moorish Spain, Muslim and Jewish mystic women collaborated on coded prayer books that doubled as rebel rosters, proving the divine could be delightfully pragmatic. Their legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. The lullabies sung to children in Occitania still contain fragments of their prophecies. The stained glass in a Bavarian chapel, commissioned by an abbess sympathetic to rebellion, hides rebel sigils in its patterns. Even the humble rosary beads used today descend from those twisted by mystic fingers, each knot a silent echo of resistance. These women understood something tyrants never could, that the most dangerous rebellions aren't those fought for land or gold, but for the soul. And once ignited, no fire burns longer than faith. When the noose tightened around a rebel's neck, it was often a woman's hand that loosened it, not with brute force, but with an intricate web of hidden doors, whispered passwords, and moonlit trails. Across medieval Europe, women built escape networks so precise they'd put modern spy agencies to shame. Convents became way stations, their cloistered halls hiding fugitives behind false walls. Farmhouses doubled as relay points, where a loaf of bread left on a windowsill signaled it was safe to approach. These weren't just random acts of kindness. They were meticulously coordinated operations, with women acting as conductors on an underground railroad centuries before the term existed. Take the beguinages of Flanders, communities of lay religious women whose convents became the backbone of rebel escape routes. Their reputation for piety made them above suspicion, even as they hollowed out altars to hide weapons and sewed fugitives into funeral shrouds to smuggle them past checkpoints. In one documented case, a Beguine named Beatrix van Brabant orchestrated the escape of 17 rebels by disguising them as pilgrims, dyeing their hair with walnut stain, and teaching them to mimic the gait of the elderly. By the time authorities realized the pilgrim band was a ruse, the men were already across the border, their identities erased like ink in the rain. But you didn't need a wimple to run an escape network. Tavern keepers' wives were especially adept, using the constant flow of travelers to mask rebel movements. A seemingly drunken lullaby might contain directions to a safe house, while a spilled ale could signal danger. In the Scottish Highlands, a woman named Eileen Nick Donshade famously turned her inn's midden heap into a escape hatch. Rebels would dive into the reeking pile to access a tunnel leading to the loch, where fishing boats waited under cover of darkness. The stench was so overpowering that English soldiers refused to search it, never realizing their quarry was slipping away beneath their noses. The true genius of these networks lay in their adaptability. When one route was compromised, women pivoted instantly. During the Albigensian Crusade, Cathar women used funeral processions as cover, hiding fugitives among mourners and even placing them in coffins with breathing tubes. In Castile, washerwomen stretched their laundry lines between buildings to create makeshift barricades, slowing pursuers just enough for rebels to vanish into the maze of alleyways. And in occupied Wales, a chain of herbalists passed rebels from shop to shop under the guise of seeking remedies for a fictitious plague, each treatment actually a coded instruction for the next leg of the journey. Some escape artists specialized in disguise. A noblewoman in Lombardy kept a wardrobe of servants' clothes tailored to fit rebel leaders, while a Venetian courtesan taught fugitives to walk and speak like merchants. Their most daring trick, exploiting superstition. In Bohemia, a group of midwives spread rumors that a certain forest was haunted, then used the abandoned woodcutters' paths to spirit Hussite rebels to safety. By the time soldiers mustered the courage to investigate, they found only ghost lights, actually carefully placed lanterns operated by pulley systems from a nearby cave. What made these women so effective wasn't just their courage, it was their deep knowledge of human nature. They understood that the best hiding places weren't always physical. A nun in Normandy smuggled a rebel commander to freedom by having him pose as a statue of Saint Michael for 3 days, his gilded paint and rigid posture fooling even the abbey's caretakers. Another in Bavaria exploited her bishop's vanity. Knowing he'd never admit he couldn't read Hebrew, she hid a fugitive rabbi in plain sight as her scripture tutor, the bishop nodding approvingly at their lessons while rebels regrouped in the countryside. Their legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. That ivy-covered abbey wall with the oddly placed grate, it once led to a priest's hole, the folk song about a lady in the moon. It was originally sung to guide night runners to safe houses. These women didn't just save lives, they wove defiance into the fabric of everyday life, proving that sometimes the quietest hands hold the sharpest knives. When conquerors burned books and banned languages, it was women who kept the soul of resistance alive, not in grand declarations, but in the hum of a lullaby, the twist of an embroidery thread, the rhythm of a harvest song passed hand to hand like a sacred torch. Oppressors could crush armies and tear down banners, but how do you eradicate something as intangible as a melody sung under one's breath or a folktale told by firelight? This was the quiet warfare of cultural custodians, women who turned tradition into an unbreakable chain linking generations. In the Welsh rebellions against English rule, mothers taught their children to count using rhymes that secretly tallied the number of occupying soldiers in nearby garrisons. A game of jump rope in a Breton village might have lyrics mapping escape routes through the woods, the rhythm syncing with the pounding of little feet to imprint the knowledge deep in muscle memory. These weren't just games, they were encrypted survival manuals disguised as play. The artistry of these women was breathtaking in its subtlety. A tapestry hanging in a noblewoman's hall could depict an idyllic hunting scene unless you knew to follow the flight of the embroidered falcon, which traced the path to hidden rebel camps. In Moorish Spain, Jewish women braided challah bread in patterns that mirrored mountain passes used by fugitives, the edible maps consumed before raids. Even something as mundane as the way herbs were bundled at market, time-tied with red thread instead of twine, could signal safe houses to those in the know. Religious rituals became another vessel for preservation. In Ireland, women kept Gaelic poetry alive by reciting it as prayers during sanctioned Catholic Mass, the Latin responses masking older invocations to banned deities. Hungarian midwives incorporated pre-Christian birth chants into lullabies, ensuring pagan cosmologies survived despite church purges. The most daring act of cultural sabotage might have been the Lithuanian women who wove traditional sun symbols into the linens of Teutonic knights, their enemies unknowingly sleeping under the very emblems they sought to erase. Music was perhaps their most potent weapon. A dirge for a fallen rebel banned by authorities would reappear as a love ballad with altered lyrics, the original melody intact, waiting to be reclaimed. In the Alps, women yodeled across valleys using cadences that mimicked the local dialect, allowing messages to travel farther than shouted words. A Venetian courtesan's lute song, seemingly about unrequited love, contained acrostic verses naming collaborators with the enemy, the scandalous lyrics ensuring they spread like wildfire through taverns and docks. The brilliance of these custodians lay in their understanding that culture isn't just art, it's identity. When physical resistance failed, a people who remembered their stories, songs, and symbols could rise again. A 14th century Sephardic proverb whispered by these women said it best: "They took our land, but we carry the map in our bones." Long after swords rusted and castles fell, the traditions they safeguarded would whisper to future generations reminders that some victories aren't measured in territory taken, but in what refuses to die. In a world where women were expected to kneel in prayer or bend over hearths, some chose instead to grip swords, command troops, and rewrite the rules of war. These were the gender norm disruptors, women who didn't just resist tyranny, but shattered the very cages society built around them. Take Joan of Arc, the most famous example, but far from the only one. While her story is often framed as divine intervention, what truly terrified her enemies wasn't her visions. It was her audacity to stand shoulder to shoulder with male soldiers, her armor fitted just like theirs, her voice giving orders instead of pleas. She wasn't an anomaly. She was part of a hidden tradition of women who refused to let biology dictate their role in history. Consider the lesser-known but equally formidable figures like Sicilgata of Salerno, an 11th century Lombard princess who didn't just advise her husband on military campaigns. She led charges in full armor, her presence on the battlefield so routine that chroniclers stopped remarking on it as unusual. Or the Basque pirate Maria Pita, who defended her city against the English Armada by hurling a spear through an invader's chest, then rallying citizens with a cry that became legend: "Whoever has honor, follow me." These women didn't ask permission to defend their homes. They seized weapons and authority with the same certainty as their male counterparts. But disrupting norms wasn't always about brute force. In the workshops of medieval Europe, women like the Flemish weaver Margaret van Eyck quietly upended expectations by running guilds traditionally reserved for men. When authorities demanded taxes from her all-female weaving collective, she didn't plead. She negotiated like a merchant prince, securing exemptions that kept her community afloat. Similarly, Jewish moneylenders like Rachel of Mainz wielded financial clout typically denied to women, using their networks to fund resistance efforts under the guise of business transactions. Their power wasn't in swords but in ledgers, and their male detractors couldn't dismiss them without bankrupting themselves. The most radical acts often unfolded in plain sight. Noblewomen like Elena of Castile manipulated courtly conventions to their advantage, hosting literary salons where troubadours sang coded critiques of oppressive rulers. What seemed like cultural refinement was actually subversion, their gatherings breeding grounds for dissent disguised as entertainment. Even peasant women found loopholes. In Breton villages, female fishermen, officially banned from boats, took to the waves as net menders, then steered vessels when no men were watching, their knowledge of tides and currents rivaling any admiral's. What made these women so dangerous wasn't just their actions, but the precedent they set. Every time a woman held a sword, balanced a ledger, or plotted a rebellion, she chipped away at the myth of female incapacity. Oppressors could crush a rebellion, but how do you unteach the lesson that half your population might be just as capable as the other half? Their legacy wasn't just in battles won or treaties signed. It was in the quiet realization they forced upon the world that the roles society assigned were arbitrary, and the moment women stopped obeying, the entire system trembled. These disruptors paid a steep price, of course. Many were labeled heretics, witches, or harlots, their achievements erased or twisted into cautionary tales. But in their defiance, they planted seeds that would outlast them. When a 15th century Florentine chronicler grumbled about women who forget their place, he unwittingly proved their victory. The old order was already cracking, one unruly woman at a time. Centuries later, their stories remind us that the most revolutionary act isn't always changing the system sometimes. It's simply refusing to play by its rules. A basket of wet laundry flapping in the breeze might seem like the most ordinary sight, but in the hands of medieval resistance women, those fluttering linens became a weapon. Across occupied territories, women transformed mundane chores into sophisticated communication systems, their creativity turning the everyday into the extraordinary. A shirt hung upside down on a line could warn of approaching soldiers. A blanket folded just so might signal which forest path was safe. These weren't just housekeeping tasks. They were lifelines stitched into the fabric of daily life so seamlessly that oppressors never thought to look twice. The genius of these systems lay in their invisibility. While men risked capture carrying written messages, women developed silent languages that required no paper and left no trail. In 13th century Occitania, Cathar women embroidered seemingly decorative patterns into tablecloths, their stitches forming maps of hidden mountain passes. A Welsh weaver's daughter might pause her loom at precise intervals, the rhythm of her shuttle conveying troop movements to rebels listening in the next room. Even the way bread was scored before baking held meaning. A cross cut deep into the crust could indicate a safe house, while a shallow slash warned of betrayal. Some codes leveraged the natural world. Breton fishwives arranged their catches at market in specific sequences. 3 mackerel followed by a crab meant ships were arriving under cover of fog. In Flanders, the angle at which a milkmaid placed her pail on a windowsill could reveal whether enemy officers were drunk or alert. The most elaborate systems turned entire villages into living switchboards. A woman sweeping her doorstep at noon might be relaying a message to a neighbor hanging herbs across the lane, who then signaled the blacksmith's wife by adjusting her shawl, a chain of ordinary gestures that together spelled danger or opportunity. Religious devotion offered another layer of camouflage. Nunneries became hubs for coded psalms, where the emphasis on certain syllables concealed meeting times. Pilgrims' badges sewn onto cloaks in particular arrangements marked couriers to those who knew how to look. One daring abbess in Saxony composed hymns where the number of repetitions in each verse corresponded to the days until an attack. To the faithful, it was beautiful music. To rebels, it was a battle plan set to melody. Perhaps the most heartbreakingly beautiful examples came from mothers teaching their children these silent arts. A lullaby's tempo might sync with the pacing of castle guards outside. A game of hopscotch played with pebbles could secretly map patrol routes. These women weren't just passing information, they were preserving an entire language of resistance, ensuring that even if they fell, the next generation would keep speaking in codes woven through their very childhoods. The legacy of these communicators lives on in unexpected places. That folk pattern on your grandmother's quilt, it might descend from rebel blueprints. The odd stitching inside an antique christening gown possibly coordinates to a long-lost safe house. These women proved that revolution doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the rustle of a skirt, the arrangement of flowers in a vase, or the way a shadow falls across a half-open shutter. Their greatest triumph wasn't just outsmarting tyrants, but reminding us that the most powerful messages often hide in plain sight, waiting for those with the wit to read them. When the hunt for rebels reached its peak, when forests and caves were no longer safe, resistance movements survived because of ordinary doors left unlatched in the night. A convent cellar, a merchant's attic, a brothel's back room. These became the unsung fortresses of rebellion, all because women chose to risk everything to keep a candle burning in the window. These safe havens weren't just hiding places, they were nerve centers where strategies were forged, wounds were stitched, and hope was kept alive under floorboards and behind false walls. Consider the beguinages of the Low Countries communities of lay religious women whose homes became way stations for fugitives. Their reputation for charity gave them cover to operate in plain sight. A sick ward in the back might house a rebel leader recovering from battle, his presence explained away as a pilgrim stricken with fever. In one documented case, a beguine named Lotgardis of Bruges disguised a wounded fighter as a leper, wrapping him in bandages soaked with foul-smelling herbs to repel curious soldiers. For months he convalesced in her courtyard, passing messages through the rhythmic tapping of his cane against the cobblestones. But sanctity wasn't the only disguise. Brothels, often dismissed as dens of vice, became unlikely hubs of resistance. The very secrecy that shrouded their operations made them perfect for hiding rebels in plain sight. In 14th century Paris, a madame known only as La Rouse ran a network that smuggled fighters through underground tunnels connected to her cellar. Her clients included city guards who, in their drunkenness, never noticed the extra place settings at her table were for fugitives dining just out of sight. Meanwhile, Venetian courtesans used their privileged access to powerful men to glean intelligence, then passed it along through coded love notes left in church confessionals. Domestic spaces held even greater ingenuity. A Flemish brewer's wife hollowed out her massive ale vats to create hideouts, the stench of fermentation masking any trace of human scent. In Castile, a widow named Ingenuity de Torres turned her chicken coop into a rebel dormitory, the constant clucking and rustling covering the sounds of whispered plans. The most audacious might have been a group of Catalan grandmothers who hid an entire rebel cell in their shared bakery each morning. The men emerged covered in flour, pushing bread carts alongside the real bakers as if they'd been there all along. The logistics of these sanctuaries were breathtaking. Safe houses needed rotating to avoid suspicion, so women developed intricate signaling systems. A red petticoat hung from a balcony meant danger. A blue one signaled all clear. In Scotland, peat stacks arranged in certain patterns told rebels which farms to approach under cover of darkness. Welsh shepherdesses used their dogs to deliver food to hidden caves, the animals trained to follow scent trails rebels, laid with drops of lavender oil. Every mundane detail of domestic life became a tool for subterfuge. The cost of discovery was unthinkable. In Lombardy, an entire nunnery was burned to the ground after soldiers found rebel correspondence sewn into a choir book. A tavern keeper's wife in Ghent had her hands severed for serving ale to resistance fighters. Yet women kept opening their doors because they understood a fundamental truth: rebellions can't thrive on battlefields alone. They need places where the hunted can catch their breath, where maps can be studied by candlelight, where a hot meal and a whispered, "You're safe here," can restore the will to fight another day. These women's names rarely made it into chronicles. Landlords and abbesses didn't inspire ballads like sword-wielding heroes, but their legacy is written in the rebellions that outlasted their oppressors, in the fugitives who lived to see victory because someone, somewhere, left a door unlocked just long enough. In the heat of rebellion, when rage blurred the line between justice and vengeance, women often stood as the last guardians of conscience. While battlefields ran red and the temptation for retribution grew overwhelming, these women did something extraordinary. They reminded fighters what they were fighting for. Take the case of the 14th century French peasant women who intercepted a band of rebel soldiers preparing to burn a village suspected of collaborating. Throwing themselves between the torches and the huts, they didn't plead, they challenged. "Is this who we are?" one reportedly demanded, holding up a child's doll found in the dirt. Will we become the monsters we swore to overthrow? That moment of moral clarity, sparked by women who refused to let rage eclipse purpose, turned the tide. The village was spared, and the rebels retained something far more valuable than a tactical victory: their humanity. This role of moral compass wasn't about passive virtue, it was strategic brilliance. Women understood that rebellions could win battles but lose wars of public opinion if they descended into cruelty. In the Welsh uprisings, bardic traditions tell of noble women like Gwenllian Fyrch Griffith, who enforced strict codes of conduct among rebel bands. Looting or harming civilians meant expulsion from the cause, no matter how skilled the fighter. Her reasoning was razor sharp. A people's army that preys on its people is no army at all. By tying resistance to moral legitimacy, these women ensured communities saw rebels not as marauders, but as protectors worth sheltering and feeding. Religious women wielded particular influence in this realm. abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen framed ethical warfare as divine mandate, interpreting scripture to condemn torture and unnecessary violence. Their letters to rebel leaders mixed spiritual authority with cold pragmatism. "Slay 100 soldiers in fair combat, and you are a hero," one nun wrote to a Provençal resistance captain. "Slay one unarmed child, and you hand the enemy 1,000 new recruits." This wasn't just philosophy, it was psychological warfare, stripping oppressors of their ability to paint rebels as savages. Even in the darkest hours, women found ways to enforce accountability. In occupied Flanders, washerwomen developed a chillingly effective system. When rumors spread of rebels assaulting civilians, the women collectively refused to clean the accused men's linens, a public shaming that spread faster than any decree. In Lombardy, tavern keepers' wives kept black ledgers detailing misconduct, ensuring abusive fighters found no shelter in sympathetic homes. These weren't formal courts, but their judgments carried weight, preserving the fragile covenant between resistance and the communities sustaining it. Perhaps their most profound impact was in reframing mercy as strength rather than weakness. When Sicilian rebels debated executing captured enemy officers, a widow named Vanna di Coltaballotta intervened with a radical proposal: release them unharmed, but first show them the starving families their policies had created. The move, dismissed as naive by some, ultimately shattered the morale of occupying forces more effectively than any massacre. As one freed officer later confessed, "I could face swords, but not the eyes of those children." The legacy of these moral architects lingers in the unlikeliest places. A folk song about a lady who stayed the axe, a stained glass window depicting a nun shielding prisoners. Their stories remind us that the fiercest battles aren't just for land or power, but for the soul of the struggle itself. In a world where violence often begets violence, these women proved that the true measure of a rebellion's success isn't just what it destroys, but what it refuses to become. While armies clashed on battlefields, another kind of warfare raged in marketplaces and counting houses where women waged economic sabotage with the precision of military tacticians. These were the financial insurgents, the ones who understood that toppling a regime didn't always require swords when ledger books could cut just as deep. In medieval Lyon, a network of silk weavers' wives orchestrated a silent revolt against crushing taxes. They didn't march with pitchforks, they simply stopped buying salt, a heavily taxed commodity, and taught their neighbors to extract it from ashes instead. Within months, the royal salt tax revenue collapsed, forcing officials to abandon the levy. It was a masterclass in collective defiance, proving that sometimes the deadliest weapon was a withheld coin. Counterfeiting became another ingenious tactic. In occupied Flanders, women with nimble fingers and a grudge against the crown produced near-perfect replicas of enemy currency, flooding markets with worthless coins. The goal wasn't personal profit, it was chaos. As the money supply inflated, occupying troops found their pay suddenly buying half as much bread, while local rebels hoarded the genuine currency. Authorities raged about the devil's handiwork, never suspecting the culprits were the same lace makers they dismissed as simpletons. One particularly bold operation in Normandy saw noblewomen melt down their own silver to mint counterfeit coins, their ballrooms doubling as clandestine mints where the clink of metal masked the sound of rebellion being stamped into existence. But the most devastating acts of economic warfare were often the simplest. In Lombardy, tavern keepers' wives watered down ale, served to occupying soldiers while selling the good stock to rebels at a loss. Welsh shepherdesses underreported flock sizes to evade wool taxes, then funneled the hidden fleeces to rebel seamstresses. Even something as mundane as a baker's scale could become a tool of resistance, weights secretly altered to shortchange enemy quartermasters while giving extra measure to partisan families. These weren't random acts of petty theft. They were calculated strikes against supply lines, each gram of flour or inch of wool diverted like arrows loosed at the enemy's purse. The brilliance of these saboteurs lay in their deniability. A man caught forging coins faced execution, but a woman too foolish to recognize real currency. She might escape with a scolding. This perceived economic naivety became their greatest cover. When English officials in Gascony discovered tax records riddled with errors, they blamed sloppy clerks, never the widows and daughters who deliberately transposed numbers to confuse collection efforts. Similarly, a group of Catalan fishwives collapsed a hated fishing tax by accidentally dumping their catches back into the sea whenever inspectors approached, claiming the nets had torn. Their pantomime of incompetence cost the crown dearly, all while keeping their hands clean. These women's legacies challenge our very definition of warfare. They remind us that economies aren't just systems, they're living organisms, vulnerable to 1,000 small cuts. And while history remembers the siege engines that battered down gates, it was often the silent collapse of a tyrant's treasury that made those gates finally swing open. The next time you hear about a medieval tax revolt or currency crisis, look beyond the ledgers. You might just find the fingerprints of women who fought with balance sheets instead of blades, proving that the surest way to starve a beast isn't to confront its teeth, but to quietly poison its food. Before ink touched parchment, before chronicles were penned in monastery scriptoriums, resistance lived in the breath of women who spun rebellion into stories. In flickering firelight and hushed hearthside gatherings, these keepers of oral histories wove defeat and triumph into tales that outlasted empires. Picture a 12th century Breton grandmother, her fingers pausing over wool as she recounts how her own mother smuggled messages in her hair, not as dry fact, but as a thrilling adventure where the heroine outwits soldiers with nothing but wit and a well-timed sneeze. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were covert history lessons, ensuring that even if records were burned, the essence of the struggle would survive in the collective memory. The power of these oral historians lay in their subtlety. A lullaby about a fox stealing the hunter's boots might chronicle a real rebel's escape, its catchy melody ensuring children memorized details that would have been fatal to write down. In the Scottish Highlands, where English laws banned Gaelic songs, women preserved battle tactics in weaving chants, the rhythm of the loom mimicking the cadence of marching feet, the patterns in the cloth mirroring formations used in legendary ambushes. Oppressors could confiscate weapons and burn books, but how do you eradicate a story hummed under one's breath while rocking a cradle? Some traditions turned memory into ritual. In Occitania, Cathar women staged annual harvest plays, where villagers reenacted rebel victories using coded gestures. A sickle swung 3 times to represent a fallen tyrant, a sheaf of wheat split to symbolize divided enemy forces. To outsiders, it was rustic theater. To participants, it was living history, each performance reinforcing tactics and alliances. Similarly, Basque grandmothers hosted spinning circles, where the number of twists in the yarn corresponded to dates of uprisings, the act of creation inseparable from the act of remembering. The most ingenious oral historians embedded truths in seemingly innocuous folklore. A Welsh tale about a water spirit luring invaders into a lake might actually preserve the location where rebels drowned a patrol. A Catalan ghost story about the lady in the tower could encode the fate of a noblewoman who betrayed her rebel husband. These narratives thrived because they were adaptable details shifted with each telling to evade censors, yet the core truths remained intact, passed like a torch through generations. Their legacy lingers in the fragments we've managed to recover. That nursery rhyme about the mouse and the miller's cat, it likely began as a satire of a corrupt official's downfall. The folk dance where partners weave in and out of arches, possibly a symbolic retelling of rebels slipping through enemy lines. These women understood that history isn't just about facts, it's about keeping alive the conviction that oppression is temporary, and that those who came before us left roadmaps in their stories. Long after parchment crumbled, their whispers endured, proving that the most resilient rebellions aren't fought with steel alone, but with the stories we choose to tell. A tapestry hanging in a nobleman's castle might look like a simple decoration, but pull back a single thread, and you'll unravel a secret map to rebel hideouts. Medieval women turned art into a language of resistance, stitching subversion into the very fabric of daily life. Their tapestries weren't just wall coverings, they were coded battle plans. A hunting scene's foliage could conceal the contours of a mountain pass used by fugitives. The flight pattern of embroidered birds might trace the patrol routes of enemy soldiers. Even the colors held meaning: a cluster of red flowers signaling danger, a blue river marking a safe crossing. These women wove rebellion into beauty, knowing oppressors would admire their handiwork without ever seeing the truth hidden in plain sight. Music became another vessel for defiance. In the Welsh rebellions against English rule, women composed lullabies that doubled as military dispatches. A mother rocking her child might seem to sing about the fox in the heather, but to trained ears, the melody's rhythm counted the days until the next attack. Troubadour women in Occitania turned courtly love songs into anthems of resistance, their lyrics dripping with double meanings. A line about the Lady's Tower could reference a besieged stronghold, while a lament for the rose that withers too soon mourned a fallen rebel leader. Authorities could ban weapons and burn books, but they couldn't silence a hummed tune passed from one cottage to another. Folklore was perhaps their most potent medium. A bedtime story about a clever hare outsmarting a wolf wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival manual, teaching children how to evade capture through cunning. In Ireland, grandmothers spun tales of mythical heroes like Fionn mac Cumhaill, embedding navigation tips in the adventures. The hero's path through enchanted forests mirrored real-world escape routes, while his battles with giants allegorized clashes with occupying forces. These stories did more than preserve history. They weaponized imagination, ensuring every child grew up seeing themselves as potential heroes in an ongoing struggle. The brilliance of these artists lay in their understanding of human psychology. Oppressors expected rebellion to come with shouts and swords, not in the delicate stitches of an embroidery hoop or the refrain of a harvest song. A group of Flemish lacemakers once crafted an entire network of coded messages into their patterns, using dropped stitches and unusual knots to denote meeting times and locations. When questioned, they simply smiled and said they'd made mistakes, their supposed incompetence becoming the perfect cover. Similarly, a Breton baker's wife composed seemingly innocent rhymes about her bread's ingredients, the verses actually listing the names of traitors to avoid. Their legacy lives on in unexpected places. That folk dance where partners weave through arches, it likely originated as a symbolic reenactment of rebels slipping past checkpoints. The peculiar stitching inside antique christening gowns possibly coordinates to long-forgotten safe houses. These women proved that art isn't just a reflection of resistance, it's a weapon, forged in creativity and tempered by necessity. While kings built monuments to their own glory, these artists built something far more enduring, a language of hope that could never be fully erased, only waiting for the right eyes to read it. Gossip was never just gossip in the hands of medieval resistance women. it was artillery. While armies relied on battering rams and arrows, these psychological warriors launched campaigns of whispers so potent they could collapse an occupying force from the inside out. Picture a bustling marketplace where fishwives chuckle over their stalls, their laughter carrying rumors designed to unravel enemy morale. A casual comment about dwindling supplies in the garrison, an exaggerated sigh about unrest brewing among the troops, a hushed confession that the commander's wife was seen fraternizing with rebels, each tidbit carefully crafted to spread like wildfire, eroding trust and discipline among oppressors. Some of the most devastating tactics played on superstition. In the Scottish Highlands, women spun tales of prophetic dreams where English soldiers drowned in lochs or were devoured by spectral hounds. These stories, shared at wells and hearths, took root in the minds of superstitious troops, some so unnerved they deserted under cover of darkness. A similar strategy unfolded in Bohemia, where Hussite women spread rumors that their rebel leader possessed a flaming sword gifted by angels, a myth so persistent that enemy soldiers reportedly fled at the sight of torchlight reflecting on metal. The power of these stories wasn't in their truth, but in their ability to turn fear itself into a weapon. Noble women elevated psychological warfare to an art form. A countess hosting an enemy officer for dinner might sigh over his commander's failing health, planting seeds of doubt about leadership. Others orchestrated elaborate ruses, like the Castilian matron who staged a fake letter from a disillusioned knight describing phantom rebel reinforcements. When the letter accidentally fell into enemy hands, entire battalions delayed their advance, buying precious time for resistance fighters to regroup. Even convents became hubs of misinformation, nuns confessing fabricated sins to priests known to sympathize with occupiers, knowing the secrets would reach the right ears. The true brilliance of these tactics lay in their deniability. A man caught spreading rebel propaganda faced execution, but a woman merely repeating village chatter. She could feign ignorance with a flutter of her lashes. In Flanders, a group of lace makers perfected the art of the accidental slip, loudly misunderstanding troop movements they'd overheard, ensuring false intelligence reached enemy spies. Their masterpiece, convincing a Spanish garrison that their paymaster had absconded with the payroll, a lie that sparked a mutiny before the truth could catch up. But the most insidious rumors targeted the very fabric of an invader's identity. Welsh women whispered that English soldiers stationed too long in their valleys would go native, their children born speaking the language of the oppressed. In Lombardy, tavern keepers' wives seeded stories that occupying troops were being replaced by more loyal regiments, sparking jealous infighting. These weren't just lies, they were psychological viruses engineered to exploit insecurities and fracture unity. The legacy of these psychological warriors lingers in unexpected places. That nursery rhyme about the baker's doomed feast, it likely began as a morale-sapping jab at a besieged garrison's rations. The folk tale of the weeping soldier's ghost, probably rooted in a rumor campaign that drove a young conscript to desert. These women understood a timeless truth. Sometimes the deadliest battles aren't fought with steel, but with the stories we choose to believe. Behind every rebel who picked up a sword stood a woman holding together the fragile world he left behind. While battles raged beyond village walls, these guardians of rebel families performed a quieter, more relentless kind of warfare, one fought in root cellars with crying babies muffled against their chests, in moonlit fields where children were taught to hide at the snap of a twig. Theirs was a dual existence, tending hearths with one hand while keeping daggers tucked in their aprons, singing lullabies that doubled as survival lessons. A mother bouncing a child on her knee might seem like the picture of domestic tranquility, but that same woman could transform into a ferocious protector when soldiers kicked down her door, her body a living barricade between the invaders and the tiny future resistors clinging to her skirts. Consider the Breton peasant women who turned their cottages into fortresses of normalcy amid chaos. While husbands and sons hid in the forests, these women maintained the illusion of quiet village life, baking bread, mending clothes, attending mass, all while smuggling food to fugitives and teaching toddlers to lie about their father's whereabouts. Their greatest weapon wasn't steel, but routine. By keeping homes functioning, they made entire communities appear harmless, deflecting suspicion that might have led to massacres. A Welsh chronicle tells of one such woman, Gwenllian Fyrch Llewellyn, who hosted English officers for tea while her rebel husband slept buried beneath the straw of her stable. Her calm hospitality, the perfect scones, the strategically spilled wine that redirected prying eyes became as vital to the resistance as any battlefield charge. The emotional labor these women carried was its own form of combat. They concocted plausible alibis for missing men, a sudden pilgrimage, a distant apprenticeship, weaving lies so convincing they sometimes comforted their own children with them. In Lombardy, a network of midwives falsified birth records to conceal rebel lineages, inking false names into parish registers with the same care they used to deliver babies. Others, like the Flemish matriarch Beatrix van Dam, orchestrated elaborate ruses where neighboring women would recognize fugitives as their own long-lost cousins during identity checks, the shared performances more convincing than any document. Education became covert resistance. A geometry lesson might secretly teach a child to calculate the height of castle walls. A recited prayer could contain coded messages about supply routes. In Occitania, mothers baked alphabet cookies shaped like regional landmarks, turning snack time into cartography. The most poignant examples come from Gaelic Ireland, where hedge schools run by women kept forbidden language and history alive under the guise of knitting circles. A grandmother's seemingly rambling folktale about a fox stealing eggs might actually recount a rebel ambush, ensuring tactics survived even if the fighters didn't. The physical protection these women provided often bordered on the supernatural. In the Pyrenees, shepherdesses hid children in caves only accessible by narrow ledges, carrying infants on their backs like mountain goats. Venetian fishwives devised floating cradles that could be sunk beneath dock pilings at a moment's notice, the babies breathing through hollow reeds. Some even weaponized superstition, like the Gascon widow who painted her door with chicken blood and whispered of curses, deterring searches more effectively than any lock. Their ingenuity turned every household item into a potential lifesaver. A laundry basket's false bottom could hide a child, while a simmering pot of pungent herbs masked infant cries during raids. Perhaps their most profound legacy was in nurturing the psychological resilience of the next generation. While war could harden fighters, these women ensured it didn't hollow out their children. Basque mothers composed lullabies that acknowledged fear but promised protection. Bohemian grandmothers carved tiny wooden heroes for children to clutch during bombardments, transforming terror into tales of future victory. In doing so, they accomplished the impossible, raising children who could both survive oppression and dream beyond it. The rebellion's longevity didn't depend solely on today's battles, but on the unbroken spirits of those who would fight tomorrow. These women's stories shatter the myth that caregiving and resistance exist in separate realms. Every soup kettle kept boiling during famine was an act of defiance. Every night a child fell asleep feeling safe in occupied territory was a victory. Their triumphs rarely made chronicles, but you can trace them in the unbroken lineages of rebel families, in the lullabies that still carry encrypted warnings, in the way certain villages against all odds kept resistance alive for generations. The true measure of their success wasn't just in lives saved, but in the undeniable truth they embodied, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply ensuring there's someone left to remember. Victories on the battlefield meant nothing if no one remembered why the blood was spilled, and medieval women made forgetting impossible. While kings built stone monuments to their own glory, these legacy builders crafted memorials that breathed, spoke, and sang. In the Welsh valleys, mothers composed lullabies listing the names of fallen rebels, their melodies ensuring children memorized heroes before they could even walk. Breton grandmothers knotted intricate fishing nets while recounting every ambush and betrayal, the rhythm of their fingers syncing with the rhythm of the story until the past felt as tangible as the rope in their hands. These weren't just tales, they were time capsules deliberately designed to outlast oppression. Take the Singing Stones of Occitania, where women etched rebel symbols into boundary markers and millstones. To outsiders, they were simple property lines, but to locals, their carvings mapped escape routes and mass graves. A farmer plowing his field might pause at a particular rock, tracing its grooves with his thumb while whispering to his son, "This marks where your great-grandmother hid the wounded." Similarly, in Flanders, weavers incorporated rebel sigils into marriage cloaks, patterns so subtle they escaped notice, yet ensured every wedding became a silent tribute to resistance. Balladeers wielded perhaps the most potent tools of remembrance. A 13th-century nun in Saxony transformed a rebel leader's execution into a hymn so haunting, even the executioner's grandchildren sang it generations later. Moorish women in Granada composed cradle songs about the Alhambra's fall, their lyrics weaving loss with longing until children dreamed of recapturing what their parents had lost. The genius of these songs lay in their adaptability. Each retelling updated the struggle, ensuring relevance never faded. A verse about the eagle's shadow might originally warn of Norman invaders, but a century later it signaled French scouts. Education became another battleground for memory. In Ireland, hedge school matrons taught forbidden poetry under the guise of needlework lessons, their needles stitching rebellion into samplers alongside alphabet letters. A Basque grandmother's recipe for chestnut soup might include oral histories of village uprisings between instructions for peeling and roasting. Even children's games carried weight. The Scottish King's Chair skipping rhyme actually preserved the trial speech of a martyred rebel, its bouncing rhythm making the words impossible to forget. The most poignant memorials were often the most intimate. A Lombard widow buried her husband's rebel cloak beneath their hearthstone, telling their children the fire's warmth was his embrace. Catalan mothers braided lockets of their sons' hair into candle wicks, so their light still fought the darkness. These acts transformed grief into something generative, ensuring every flickering flame or sung verse became a thread connecting past to future. Their legacy proves that remembrance isn't passive, it's a deliberate act of defiance. While official histories were written by conquerors, these women authored counter-narratives in thread, ink, and song. Today, when scholars puzzle over how certain rebellions remained alive in cultural memory centuries after their defeat, the answer often lies not in dusty archives, but in the lullabies grandmothers still hum, the patterns woven into family heirlooms, or the way a particular hill's name rolls off local tongues whispering truths no victor could ever fully erase. History's spotlight has long favored the clash of steel and the roar of battlefields, but the truth is far more intricate. Medieval resistance movements didn't just survive on brute strength. They thrived because of the women who moved like shadows, their contributions as vital as any sword strike yet erased from the chronicles. These women weren't just helpers, they were strategists, healers, financiers, and spies who turned oppression's blind spots into weapons. Their stories force us to confront a glaring question. How many revolutions have we misunderstood because we ignored the hands that stitched them together in the dark? Consider the sheer scope of what they accomplished. While knights fought on open fields, women like the Beguines of Flanders ran clandestine, escaped networks from their convents, their piety masking rebel hideouts. Market women transformed gossip into intelligence operations, their chatter at the fish stalls carrying coded warnings. Noble women leveraged their social status to broker alliances, their drawing rooms becoming war rooms draped in lace and pretense. Even the most mundane tasks, baking bread, hanging laundry, singing lullabies, were often acts of defiance. Each loaf, fold, and note a thread in a vast, invisible tapestry of resistance. The legacy of these women does more than rewrite history. It redefines what we consider power. We're taught to equate strength with visibility, but theirs was a different kind of influence, the quiet certainty of a midwife smuggling messages in her birthing kit, the calculated risk of a merchant's wife doctoring ledgers to fund rebellions, the courage of a peasant woman teaching her children to lie to soldiers. Their victories weren't marked by parades or monuments, but in the survival of communities, the preservation of culture, and the unbroken chains of knowledge passed through generations. This isn't just about correcting the past, it's about illuminating a pattern that repeats even today. How many movements for justice rely on unseen labor? How many revolutions are sustained by those history will overlook? The medieval women who kept resistance alive challenge us to look beyond the obvious heroes, to recognize that change often wears an apron, carries a market basket, or hums a lullaby instead of a war cry. Their stories remind us that the most enduring rebellions aren't always the loudest, but the ones rooted in the quiet, unshakable refusal to let hope die. So the next time you walk past a tapestry in a museum or hear an old folk song, pause, look closer, listen harder. The threads and notes might just hold secrets, whispers of the women who proved that history isn't just written by the victors, but by those who refuse to let their stories be buried. If these untold tales have sparked something in you, share them. Talk about the market women who outsmarted kings, the nuns who turned convents into spy hubs, the grandmothers who weaponized lullabies. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember, and it's time these women took their place in the light.